Rich racist humiliated a black waiter in a wedding, but bitterly regretted it. It was a perfect summer day. The sky, a deep, cloudless blue, seemed to have been painted by hand, like an immaculate canvas stretched over an ideal landscape.
The mansion, majestic and solitary, stood outside the city, far from the noise and chaos.
Its architecture, a blend of classic elegance and modern grandeur, shone under the rays of the sun. The entrance to the estate was majestically lined with marble statues, each capturing a different mythological figure, giving the scene a timeless allure. The main path, paved with smooth stones, wound in a perfect succession of curves to the large solid wooden door, decorated with delicate carvings that seemed to tell the story of the Montfort ancestors. Through this door, the outside world seemed to disappear. It was another universe, that of wealth, power, and privileges. The carefully chosen guests were invited to celebrate the union of two of the country's greatest fortunes. Clarice and Antoine Montfort, the young heirs, symbolized the height of the local elite, uniting not only their lives, but also their dynasties. This wedding, more than just a celebration, was an event that would leave its mark, an evening where history, tradition, and luxury blended in a hypnotic dance. The reception room was a masterpiece of luxury, a symphony of opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from majestic ceilings, showering diners with soft, glowing light. The walls were decorated with paintings and gilding, and the floor was covered with Italian marble of rare purity, polished until it became almost a mirror. Fresh flowers, white roses and pink peonies, lined every corner, giving off a delicate scent that mingled with that of the refined, impeccably presented dishes. The guests, dressed in haute couture suits and dresses, seemed to be actors in a play that they performed to perfection, where each movement, each gesture, was choreographed by decades of tradition and richness. But in the midst of this splendor was Darnell, a young black waiter in his 30s, discreet and measured, with a natural elegance which subtly contrasted with the extravagance of his environment. His eyes, piercing and attentive, scrutinized every detail, every gesture of the guests, like an invisible sentinel in this universe where he was not supposed to belong. Darnell had grown up in a modest part of town, far from this opulence. His father, a renowned but humble chef, had taught him to be proud of his work, to always maintain his dignity, no matter the circumstances. But this evening was going to be different. This evening would test everything he had learned about himself and the society around him. The wedding was in full swing, and the guests were dazzled by the brilliance of the moment. Laughter, enthusiastic conversations, and the clatter of cutlery against china mixed with the light, sophisticated music in the background. The dishes served were works of culinary art, each more refined than the last. Champagne, in silver cascades, circulated between the tables, and admiring glances met. Among the guests, a group of young men from the most influential families in the country particularly stood out. Their arrogance was matched only by their carelessness, and their loud laughter split the air like an electric discharge. They talked loudly, laughed even louder, and openly mocked those they considered extras in their glittering world. Darnell saw them as he passed by their table, a tray of canapés in his hand. Their attention immediately focused on him, and one of the young men, visibly already drunk, stared at him with a look of contempt. He said, in a mocking tone heavily tinged with racism,
"Hey, you there, the server, are you lost?"
"This is not where you should be." A heavy silence fell briefly, before a burst of laughter rose around the table. The other guests, witnesses to the scene, exchanged knowing glances, some amused, others embarrassed but too shy to intervene. This laughter, this mocking laughter, pierced the air with the same ease as a sword. Darnell's mere presence at their table seemed to bother them, as if a black man, dressed in a waiter's uniform, didn't deserve to be in this sacred space of high society. But Darnell, faithful to his father's teaching, did not let himself be defeated. He lowered his head slightly, and without saying a word, continued his service. He hoped that the humiliation would dissipate, that the insults would dissipate with the wind, like a passing breeze. But that was only the beginning. Another guest, an older man, dressed in a designer suit and wearing sunglasses, stood up and walked towards Darnell with an air of disconcerting superiority. He stopped in front of him, looking down on him, and in a condescending tone said, "You know, we could hire more qualified people for these kinds of events, right? I can't even imagine what you can do, other than carrying trays." Darnell felt the heat of anger rise within him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that giving in to provocation, whether he accepted it or not, would only make the situation worse. He remembered his father's words. In this world, sometimes your silence is more powerful than your words. So, he just stared at the floor, and continued to tend to the neighboring table. But in his mind, a fire was growing.
The frustration, the anger, the injustice, all of it boiled beneath the surface.
And then the worst happened. While serving hors d'oeuvres at another table, one of the young men suddenly stood up, drunk and impulsive. He spilled a cup of wine on Darnell's uniform, the purple liquid spreading across the fabric with disconcerting ease. The young man burst out laughing, and one of his friends, just as detestable, yelled, "Look at that!" The servant dropped his wine.
This is what happens when you don't belong here.
The laughter of the guests grew louder and louder, their mockery ringing in the air like poison. Darnell felt his heart tighten, a heavy heat rising within him, but he knew that anger, no matter how justified, would not be his ally tonight. This was not the first time he had suffered such humiliation. But this day was different. This time the guests' words, full of disdain and arrogance, found their way into his soul, where his silence had always found refuge. He felt that the attack was no longer just against his person, but against everything he represented. A man from a modest background, but proud and determined to impose himself without conforming to the expectations of others. He then stood up, every muscle in his body tense, and set down his tray with controlled slowness. This simple gesture, as innocuous as it seemed, marked a turning point. It was as if, in this gesture, he stripped himself of the invisible chains that held him in silent submission. The murmur in the room died away suddenly, and all eyes turned to him. But it was a different look. That of a man who no longer gives in. "I'll make you an offer, gentlemen. You can continue to make fun of me if it amuses you. But know that I am more than just a server. I am not a decoration in your show. I am someone who deserves respect. And I don't need your validation to know who I am." His voice was calm, but each word hit like a punch. He had the impression that, for the first time, he was speaking not just to these arrogant young people, but to the entire society that had trained them and given them this power. He felt her gaze becoming unwavering, a gleam of challenge shining in her eyes. He was no longer an invisible man. He was no longer a pawn in a game that was not his. This moment was his, and he lived it to the fullest. A deep silence settled in the room. The whispers began, but Darnell paid them no attention. He turned on his heel and walked calmly towards the exit. His footsteps echoed in the suspended moment. Each movement of his body expressed a new certainty. He no longer wanted to be part of this world where people sought to demean others in order to elevate themselves. He was not of that class. And he made it known. But what this group of young men, and many others in the room, didn't know was that Darnell was more than just a waiter in this marriage. He was not simply a serviceman, who had to be forgotten behind the scenes. He was the son of a star chef. His father, a respected man in the culinary world, had founded a luxury catering business. This marriage, while exceptional in many ways, was part of a multi-million-dollar deal that Darnell's company had signed. It was a strategy, an opportunity hidden in the shadows, where he was both guest and observer, ready to evaluate and judge the quality of service, as any majority shareholder would. He was there to ensure the company met its obligations, not to be humiliated. When he left the room, the reaction of the caterer's director did not take long. Informed of the incident, he realized that the situation was more serious than a simple misunderstanding. Within moments, a radical decision was made. All services were suspended. The main dinner, the centerpiece of the evening, would be cancelled. The room, filled with illusions of luxury and perfection, descended into chaos. The guests, their enthusiasm shattered, were informed that nothing else would be served. No dish would end the evening. Panic set in among the guests. Murmurs of incomprehension spread, questions arose, But the grooms, Clarice and Antoine Montfort, were furious. They rushed to the director for explanations. But Darnell, already far away, had made his decision. He would not go back on his principles no matter the pressure. Respect and dignity cannot be bargained for, and this marriage, as important as it is to the reputation of their families, was not worth sacrificing at this price.
The next morning, the incident made the headlines.
The Montforts and the Duponts, these families once symbols of an aristocracy at the top of society, were now caught in a whirlwind of criticism. Their names, previously associated with prestige and opulence, were now synonymous with racial prejudice and arrogance. Social networks were ablaze. Criticisms were pouring out. Celebrities, politicians, influencers and ordinary citizens joined the flood of outrage. Several large companies immediately terminated their contracts with the Montforts, refusing to work with people associated with such a scandal. The young men, arrogant in their position, were forced to apologize publicly. But it was too late. The image they had built for themselves was collapsing like a house of cards. In their homes, far from public view, the truth hit them with a harshness they had not anticipated. Their luxury was nothing more than an empty facade, and their place in society was now at stake. For Darnell, however, things were taking an unexpected but rewarding turn. He received hundreds of messages of support, respect and admiration from strangers, former workmates and even businesses. What he had accomplished that night was far beyond his own dignity. He sent a strong message to an entire society. No one, ever, should be defined by the color of their skin or their social status. He then decided to reinvest in his business, increase the number of contracts and develop relationships with respectful clients. But more than that, he knew that this incident had caused a turning point. A moment when, perhaps for the first time, the roots of injustice were exposed, and where the idea of mutual respect resonated much louder than the simple notion of power. This wedding, which should have been a celebration of the elite, had transformed into an event where the true principles of equality and dignity were tested and triumphed.